you see way up in the sky, making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change your course and your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Well, I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Good evening, and welcome in for episode 1.20 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History as we continue our march through the French Revolution. I made this announcement last night. I've made it in Discord, but we're halfway through the French Revolution. Much longer than I thought it was going to take to get through, but here we are. We're at least halfway through. We probably will not see an episode 1.40 in this series. Now that I've kind of looked ahead and like, okay, how am I going to plan this out with all this other stuff and how detailed I've been? So, hurry up then. Good evening, Dustin. Also, Dustin and Rocket, thank you for the hosts. So, what's going to happen, and I've said this before as well, is we're going to get to the coup of Brumaire, for those of you that may know what that is, either here or on YouTube later, which is effectively when Napoleon really takes power. And that will start the Napoleonic era in my mind. There's debate as to when the revolution ends. We've already had some conjecture about how many revolutions are there within the French Revolution. I think there's 4, but I digress. The point being is that we're going to...
I don't want to see you around here anymore. Beat it.
Vous m'entendez, monsieur?
Beat it, Vandee.
There it is. That's where Napoleon is. But the point is that we're going to continue with this level of detail through the coup of Brumaire. And the reason is because there are specific things about the state of our current world, which I really want to talk about as part of this. When we get to Napoleon, I'm actually going to condense it a little bit because Napoleon has several major impacts, but they are not quantified by the ongoing series of battles. And we're going to get to see Napoleon's battle tactics as a part of the French Revolution. So you're going to see the way in which I do things kind of compress when we get to Series 2. And it's going to stay kind of compressed until we're out of the July Monarchy, which is like the 1830s. And then we'll kind of go back to this level of detail as we start talking about the great revolutions of the mid-19th century and how that kind of spawns us into guys that are talking about, communism and socialism, and that'll help us set the stage for World War I. But I want to let you guys know there's going to be kind of it's not that I'm changing the level of detail, I'm just changing the pace at which I'm talking about that. We're going to skip over things I don't think are really important in the Napoleonic era, and we're going to kind of condense that timeline down. The second thing I wanted to talk about before we get started tonight is schedule for next week. We are going into our last week of Scare Drive. We've raised $1,690, so we're $310 away from hitting $2,000 by next. Well, I guess a week from Sunday. Monday will be a normal Destiny 2 stream at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but I'm not streaming on Wednesday afternoon. Instead, I will be streaming Tuesday night at 8 p.m. because Darkest Dungeon 2 hits early access, and we will be doing our thing. We're going to allow people to buy characters in. I'm not going to play it beforehand. We're going to see what it is, see what cards work, see what cards don't work, turn them on, turn them off, etc. So Monday, Tuesday, and then Friday night again, we'll be back for Destiny 2, and then episode 1.21 of Heavy Metal History will be next Saturday. Yeah, the game looks amazing. If you haven't seen the trailer, I'm not going to play it during this, but I played it last night. It's in Fixer Industries' Discord channel. Go have a look. They have done something amazing. I can tell already it's going to be amazing. Tux Racer, what's up? CF Live and Chunk say thank you very much for the $10 donation to Stop Soldier Suicide, rounding us out at $1,700. Stop Soldier Suicide is the charity that Scare Drive is supporting, and it is working to lower the suicide rate of veterans and active duty by 40% by the year 2030. We've raised $1,700 this month for them, and that's awesome. And every time you donate, you'll get to hear Chonk and an improvised version of Brohim. So we'll move on to tonight. Last week, we talked about and covered the National Convention putting King Louis XVI on trial and executing him. And the prior week, we had kind of covered everything else that went on within the National Convention for the most part, and we kind of weaved those two narratives together, basically from like September 1792 into the new year, into 1793. That whole thing was, talking about the transition to the National Convention and how the Mountain and the Girondins went at each other and tried to blame each other for the September massacres. CF Live with the host. Thank you very much, my friend. I think CF Live now knows what I meant by that other piece of music that he did for me, because he did do that for us as well. But it was about that whole period where the Girondins and the Mountain were taking shots at each other, attempting to blame each other. No Force with $200 donated to Stop Soldier Suicide. Are you insane? Nully, $200. You insane person. Yeah! We're $100 away. We are $100 away. No Force. Holy shit. I don't usually swear. I try not to swear during these, but holy crap, man. Thank you so much. If Mads or Manny or one of the mods could take care of delivering 70 packs of Fixer's Heavy Metal History Stream Loot cards to Null Force, I would greatly appreciate it. Holy crap, Nully. Thank you very much. You got the tears going a little bit on that one, my friend. Thank you. Wow. So what was I saying? Yeah, so we've been talking for 2 weeks about what's been going on in the National Convention. The last week was the trial. The week before that, again, was the attempts of the Girondins and the Mountain to blame each other for the September massacres and turn every possible decision into some kind of debate in the convention, just as an opportunity to oppose one another. No other reason existed in some instances for these two factions to say no to what the other was saying yes to, except for the idea that they wanted to oppose each other. And the reason, and this is the crux of tonight's episode, the reason that the convention was able to do all of this nonsense of the past 2 episodes in relative calm, without any pressure from any threat from the Prussian or Austrian army. Sturfers with the host, thank you very much. But the reason the convention was able to do this all in relative calm, without any pressure of the threat of the Allied armies invading, Demouriez! $100! And we've hit $2,000 for Stop Soldier Suicide! You insane, amazing community! I won't do it, you can't make me do it, but thank you so very much! Holy crap! You guys are awesome! Holy crap, you guys are amazing! Terry, Nully, Manny, Berlin, Dustin, I can't remember, and Rocket, Gilly, everyone who's contributed, and I can't remember all the names right now, and please don't be mad at me later for forgetting your name, but everyone who's donated, $2,000. We said we wanted to do $1,000, and now we've raised $2,000 for Stop Soldier Suicide. I still don't even have a $2,000 stretch goal. This is the way, for sure. Thank you all so very much. All right, got me, Terry. Damn it. Gotta push that back down because I gotta talk through history tonight. But thank you all so much.
Station.
Indeed. Thank you all. I like teaching history from, or talking history from just an internal love. And the fact that we were able to turn this and some Destiny play into $2,000 for a great cause, just... We are an amazing community. And I always say we are Legion together. And, I mean, we're less than 100 people that really hang out together and do stuff as the Outlaws. And we just raised $2,000. We just raised $2,000 for a cause that's going to help save some soldiers' lives. That means a ton to me, and I know to Manny and Berlin and Cy and the other vets who hang around here. Thank you all so much. I'll digress on that point. I don't want to. I want to spend the entire night focusing on the generosity of the community, but know that it is extremely. I'm extremely grateful, and I don't know what to say beyond that. But thank you. So again, the reason that the Girondins in the mountains were able to have all their infighting and bark at each other about September massacres and put the king on trial and kill him was because there was no threat from the Prussian and Austrian army. And that's going to be the topic tonight. We're finally going to finish all the matters. DJ Woo, $20 puts us over. DJ Woo out of nowhere. What's up? Not gonna get this point across. Every time apparently all I need to say is there was no threat from the Prussian and Allied army and a donation comes in. This is awesome. Thank you all so much. $2,020 for Stop Soldier Suicide, and I still owe $20 on top of that from Rocket. On that note, before we keep going, this is the DAV totals from the September to October period. $142 went to DAV. We've donated $1,705 this month or this year to DAV, and $2,345 lifetime since we started directing Twitch bits and subs to DAV. Disabled American Veterans, the other cause we support around here month to month. The $2,345 pretty much since we got going here on Twitch isn't bad at all, considering that it just comes from your subs and your bits. But there you go. So let's try this one more time. The reason the convention was able to do all that stuff was because there wasn't any real threat from the Prussian and Allied armies. Okay. And that'll be... 10 gift subs from an anonymous gifter as soon as I said it again. Who got one in there? Diablo, Stormy, Mindcall, BP, Honey got one, Matt got one, Cobalt Hawk, Siamco, Carnival, Fletch. That's a good list. Just keep saying the magic phrase. All right, so again, the reason that we were able to do all this, the reason the National Convention was able to pull this off, all this stuff, was because there was no threat from the Prussian and Allied army. And that's going to be the topic of this week's episode. We're finally going to finish all the stuff that happened at the very busy end of 1792. And then we're going to turn into the very equally busy year of 1793 in French Revolutionary history. So the French armies on the frontier, and when I mean the frontier, I'm going to use the term Low Countries. And when I say Low Countries, I'm talking about the Austrian Netherlands and the Netherlands. And the reason they're called the Low Countries is because they're sea line, they sit below sea level, so they're the Low Countries, not because of any other reason. It's actually counterintuitive because they sit more northern than Europe, but they're called the Low Countries. Anonymous, that's the bits, puts my name in there. Thank you very much. That is, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, $15. No mountains too. Yeah, but it's because they sit below sea level. The Low Countries are effectively today the Netherlands and Belgium. So the French armies were not just holding back the Allies, they were steamrolling the Allies through the entire time frame we've been discussing the past 2 weeks. And it left politics back in Paris to take their even more brutal and violent turns, there and across France. So after that victory at Valmy, and I'm going to zoom in here. This is Valmy right here. Remember we talked about the Battle of Valmy? So Battle of Valmy is right in that brown area. That's where that cannonade happened, and the Allied army said, nope, we're out of here, and they actually left France entirely. But after the victory at the Battle of Valmy, French forces went on the offensive and enjoyed an unbroken string of successes between November 1792 and March 1793 that allowed the convention to not only end a 1,000-year-old monarchy, but also to make a bold new set of claims about why the war was being fought in the first place. And they changed the narrative, and it was no longer a war about giving a quick punch in the face to the Austrians and say, we're here to prove a point. You really shouldn't mess with us. We're still France, and just leave us alone. It changed from that to, this is now about France wanting to burn down the entire old system of monarchical Europe and replace it with the fundamental values, if you can call them that, of the revolutionary, French Republic, and make it revolutionary Republican Europe. And that was the thing that no one thought was going to happen from a European perspective. They were like, it's chaos there. They'll never get organized. And, as long as we let them burn themselves down, we'll be fine. So after the Allied army abruptly, and I'm going to zoom out and look at my preview here, but after the Allied army abruptly turned around and left France after that, again, artillery cannonade, that was the Battle of Valmy in September 1792, the victorious General Demouriez, who was commander of the North, he made no effort to interfere with their retreat. He let them go. And it's wise strategically to do that, because you're letting them give ground the entire way. Why would you really engage them unless your intent is to annihilate their army? And that's really wasn't his plan. So instead, he followed the army's withdrawal, the Allied army's withdrawal, at a safe distance. And then he began to send emissaries to the Prussian leaders, so King Frederick William II's generals, asking if they wanted to cut a deal. Demouriez was of the opinion that, hey, France and Prussia were natural allies, right? This whole thing you've got going on with the Austrians is pretty new, but we both hate them. Aren't we more natural allies here? But when those missives reached King Frederick William II, he said that before any negotiations could take place, and again, this is in October 1792, that King Louis XVI would have to be restored to his throne. So that probably isn't going to work out that well, knowing what we know. You'll recall that Demouriez himself, from when we introduced him, was a constitutional royalist who abhorred the insurrection of August 10th and the abolition of the French monarchy, which had been that first order of business of the convention in the early days of September 1792. So there was nothing Demouriez could do about anything happening in Paris with the king, and as such, the negotiations just never really went anywhere. So as those talks broke down, Demouriez went back to his original plan. You'll remember his original plan was, I'm going into the Austrian Netherlands, which I'm going to call Belgium interchangeably, because that's what it is. His original plan was to go into Belgium, but he had to kind of stop that when the Allied army came in, and he met up with other French forces at Valmy, and that battle happened. But now he's going back to his original plan in November 1792. He judged his forces ready enough to cross the frontier into the Austrian Netherlands, which, again, I'll interchangeably refer to as Belgium. He had a pretty good reason to be confident about what he was trying to do, his chances. Even though his army wasn't comprised of the consummate professionals, which were typical of a European army, his forces now numbered about 32,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and contained about 100 heavy guns. The Austrians, on the other hand, only had about 20,000 troops total, garrisoning the entire length of that frontier of the Austrian Netherlands. This is where you begin to see, he meant business, but France meant business. Excuse me. But this is where you begin to see that the early stages of the impact of that volunteer force, right? From that greater mobilization of France. We kind of talked about it. We kind of hedged on the idea of the levée en masse, 3 episodes ago. But France was mobilizing people from everywhere. And remember, the September massacres occurred because there were people in Paris who wanted to go fight, but they were afraid that people, the prisoners were going to break out of the jails, and that's why they all got killed, so that they could, Danton could get all these people out to the French frontier. The sheer numbers that France will be able to muster under, you can call it conscription measures, you can call it draft, but it's not just the idea that France is effectively training a small professional army like the rest of Europe has done forever. They are now taking anybody, and in some cases forcing everybody to become part of the war effort. And it is a weight of numbers. It will become an order of magnitude difference initially between the French forces and the professional European armies that they face. So when Demouriez ordered his forces to cross the border on November 3rd, there was simply no Allied force big enough to stop him. The sheer numbers that France is able to muster here will be a decisive factor in the wars they wage over the next 15 years as the rest of Europe tries to catch up and go. The commanders of European armies are going to continuously point to France and later on Napoleon and say,
follow button.
I need an army like that if we're going to have a chance. Excuse me. And it greatly explains later on why Napoleon's able to just steamroll everybody. He's a brilliant tactician, don't get me wrong. But Napoleon had numbers. So on November 6th, Demouriez's army encountered their real first concentrated Austrian defenses. And the key thing here is, remember, the volunteers that left Paris after the September massacres did not reach the army in time for Valmy. So I guess we'll back up here. In the weeks after Valmy, this army that Demouriez had has absorbed, tens of thousands of utterly raw recruits. Sliced Brett, what's up? Welcome in. But this army had been absorbing those tens of thousands. There was about 30,000 people in Paris that wanted to go out there, or men in Paris basically, but they wanted to go out there and join that army at Valmy. They wanted to join those forces, and Danton wanted to get them out there. Well, now the army of the North had absorbed that. And these new recruits had a ton of spirit, but knew nothing about being a soldier. And that's why Demouriez delayed, because he had to spend all of October drilling this new army into some kind of shape. And he didn't have any illusions, right, that this new volunteer aspect of his force was going to be turned into some well-oiled machine. But he could teach them how to, march in the same direction at relatively the same time. And that's what he spent the month of October doing. So now he's crossing the border in November, and he runs into the first real concentrated Austrian force. And the key thing here is that the volunteers didn't run. The Austrians had stationed just short of 14,000 men along a 5-mile ridge running between the fortified city of Mons and the town of Jemappes. So we're going to show you where that is. There's Mons and there's Jemappes. Jemappes. I can't not pronounce the S. My mouth just makes those sounds. With this, he had a massively, right? He's got 32,000 infantry at this point against a 14,000, troop force. Demouriez has a massive advantage in numbers. And with this massively numerical superior force, Demouriez divides his forces into 2 columns, and he sends them on double flanking maneuvers. So basically he's going, to the left and to the right to try to surround the Austrian defenders that are along this 5-mile front between these 2 places. No. Just stick with what we're trying to talk about here, Brett. I know you know some stuff, but we're talking about the Battle of Jemappes in November 1793. Well, I struggle with it, but I took 2 years of French, so it's like I have my 8th or 9th and 10th grade French teacher's accent that's stuck back here somewhere. So he tries this flanking maneuver by taking his 32,000 troop force and dividing it effectively into 2 columns and trying to sweep around both both edges of the Austrian line. But the uncoordinated, it was waves, right? And it's uncoordinated waves. It just kept going. These waves of French troops, largely volunteers, just kept rolling over these two critical points of the line, and they just couldn't. And they just couldn't dislodge them. So around noon on the 6th of November, Demouriez switches his tactics, and he orders one massive column to form in the middle, and effectively told them, just go ram right through there. Somehow, there's a ton of you. Figure it out. They have obviously concentrated their forces on the edges of the line. We're reconstituting our forces in the middle. There's a ton of you, and there can't be that many of them up on the ridge. And this is effectively his tactic. Just go ram right through there. And it was too much for the Austrian defenders. The French captured the middle of the ridge, and then they managed to dig in, and they held it. And with that, it split the Austrian forces between Jemappes and Mons. And the thing is here, this is something Napoleon's going to do a ton later on. He's going to love to drive right down the middle and tell his forces, hey, fight on both sides, basically. But with the Austrian forces now divided, another French column was broken off, and it managed to flank the Austrian right, which is up at Jemappes. And the Austrians were required to effectively pull their entire force back down to Mons. This is a victory. It is a decisive. It's a large victory. I wouldn't say decisive. Not really here, just saying something in chat so it counts as a view. Sigh, welcome in. Look at the bottom bar. We've raised $2,020 for Stop Soldier Suicide, thanks to the generosity of the community with some insane donations from Turi and Nully tonight. We went from $1,690 to $2,000 in like the first 5 minutes of the stream. So, heart out to them. But this is a victory at the Battle of Jemappes. And like the victory at Valmy, it was immediately seized upon back in Paris and France as the fantastic victory by the new Revolutionary Army. The French took some losses, but I think the point here is we're going through the battles, Brett, from the perspective of their overall ramifications politically, because that's really why it's important. So I'm not going to get into the statistics of, casualties, because it's not that important to what we're trying to discuss here. More to the point right here with this battle is that the overwhelming numbers that were contained in the French army are what are important here, because that was the decisive factor in the victory. And the victory then turns into Paris going, we won another one. Look how great we are. And it's the overconfidence that breeds in Paris and in the convention that's important. It was espoused, this victory was espoused as proof that the old regimes of Europe could not withstand with the might of the fully mobilized French nation, even though it really wasn't fully mobilized yet. The levée en masse hasn't happened yet, but France is certainly more mobilized as a nation than the rest of Europe is. But again, like Valmy, the glory of Jemappes is overstated. Demouriez' Army of the North, which had continued to receive reserve reinforcements, had just thrown like 40,000 men at a ridge held by 14,000 defenders. It's impressive that the new raw French recruits just kept running up that hill, right? It's impressive that they had been in the army for like basically a month and followed their orders and marched where they were told and didn't run. That's a big deal. And yes, it's impressive that the French could muster this large of a force to begin with. But in all actuality, the victory does just come down to a numbers game. If those French forces had only outnumbered their opposition 2-1 maybe, as opposed to nearly 3-1, would they still have carried the day? And then that asks the question, how about if it's between an equal number of forces? If it's a 1-to-1 ratio? What if it was 20,000 versus 20,000? What happens then? And that's the real test, which was going to lay ahead on the road for France in this episode. But in the immediate aftermath of Jemappes, it was absolutely clear that the Austrians were just not prepared to adequately defend Belgium. Their forces, which had retreated back to Mons, surrendered that city to Demouriez the next day. And in exchange for safe passage, which means you're going to let us leave and not, gun us down and let us keep our small arms, they left behind all of their heavy guns. So Demouriez's army just got better artillery. And after a few days, French forces marched out of Mons, and the remaining Austrian forces in Belgium just basically got out of their way. Demouriez entered Brussels, the capital today of Belgium, but he entered Brussels on November 14th, 1792, and took it without firing a shot. That's how quickly Austria got out of his way. And then the French army starts to fan out across Belgium. And the Austrians simply withdraw from the territory entirely. So they go from, holding the line at the French border of the Austrian Netherlands, and now they're pushed basically all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire, where they're going to spend the whole winter regrouping, and they're going to regroup. So by the end of November 1792, the French were in complete control of Belgium. It's pretty spectacular considering that, in September, they were defending themselves in Valmy from they're on the doorstep of Paris, and now it's the end of November into winter, and we hold all of Belgium. It's a tremendous turnaround. Further south, so we're going to zoom this back out for you guys, and then I'll get it all recentered and everything, because one more tick back. There we go. So further south, the French had achieved even more success than Demouriez had encountered in Belgium, because they faced even less resistance. The old feudal territory of Savoy, which is right where my cursor is, it's down here, I'll zoom in. It's on the border with the Swiss Confederation, down by Lyon and Grenoble. Savoy. Savoy is where the army of the South was. It was this buffer feudal territory between France and Switzerland. It was invaded in 1792, and its capital, Nice, was captured. And then, remember when we talked about the Holy Roman Empire and how it was like this, confederation of all these little voting states, and how all along the Rhine there were all those little tiny principalities. This is where the emigres had gone until France threatened them, and they all had to leave. But those independent German principalities on the west bank of the Rhine, so that's the French side of the Rhine, found themselves completely exposed. When the Allied forces had basically retreated after Valmy, the forces assigned to the Rhine had just simply kept retreating until they were back on the east side, the safe side of the Rhine. And this left no one defending those tiny German states on the west side of the river from the advancing French. So this steady stream of high church officials and wealthy aristocrats packed up everything they could from all those little German electoral states and hightailed it across the Rhine too, because they knew what the French Revolution was. They knew it was pretty much anti-clerical and anti-aristocrats. They all got out of town. And so in turn, there's these German principalities that aren't indicated on the map, but they're there. And they basically said, come on in. Because what else are they going to do to the French? They said, hey, French guys, come on in. Go ahead and take control. All the, ecclesiastical and aristocratic leadership of these places is gone anyway. And what are we going to do? Say no? Because we don't have an army that's going to stand up to 40,000 men? And so all of these territories along the Rhine River and then running down south of Savoy just collapsed into French hands. At the same time that Belgium is collapsing into French hands. So how do we... Sorry, I look at this frog in my throat tonight. But how do we explain this sudden turnaround for France and their fortunes of war. In about 6 months, the French had turned certain annihilation after General Dillon's self-rout in April. Remember, that whole army kind of routed themselves because they got scared, and he was dumb enough to take his coat off. That happened back in April 1792. And now, the French are in full control of Belgium. Brussels has fallen. Savoy and the constellation of German principates are firmly in their hands. How do we explain that? It was impressive, tremendously impressive about face for the French, and it actually shocked the rest of Europe. Because you have to imagine, you're sitting there in April, it's like, yep, look what happened. It's exactly what we thought. The French are disorganized. They don't know what they're doing. They scared themselves into retreating. 6 months later, how the heck is France on the door to the Holy Roman Empire and, the Netherlands, the Dutch lowlands? The big overarching explanation here is that the Allies clearly underestimated just how resilient the French would be. The Allied strategy had essentially, been to invade France, blow through their disorganized army, and just capture Paris. Should have taken no more than 2 months, according to those Prussian planners back in the spring of 1792, if you recall. But from the outset of the war, the Allies were not simply prepared to fight an actual war. They thought that they were going to win by marking present, effectively. And that explains a lot of it. That the Allies just weren't prepared and they underestimated France. It explains a lot of it from the outset. But what it does not explain is why the French were able to give the fight back to the Allies, right? Because initially it was like, oh, let's just hold, it was a defensive war according to everything that was flying around the Legislative Assembly at the time. We're just defending the French Revolution from outside invaders. But then they turned that around and said, boop, and they punched Austria and Prussia in the nose in Belgium, and they took the fight to them and they won. So first of all, the new concept that every citizen was a potential soldier. The early phases of the fully mobilized French nation was working the way it was supposed to. We've been talking about Demouriez' army. It's, 40,000 roughly strong at the time we're talking about November 1792. But over the course of the year, 180,000 Frenchmen volunteered to serve in 1792 alone. 180,000. And this is important. No one had ever had an army that big on Earth in history to that point, except for maybe the Romans. Brett? So I get what you're doing. You're having fun with the concept of the revolution, but chat in these episodes tends to focus on exchange of concepts that are happening and, questions and things like that. So try to direct it back there, my friend. Well, 180,000 Frenchmen, that's volunteered. That's on top of the standing regular French army. Europe hadn't seen a force like that since the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was stretched, all the way out into, out in the Middle East. It was massive. They needed an army that big. Now you're just talking about France. I've seen estimates that the largest the Roman Empire's army was at the height of things that, like Trajan, was like at 310,000. So 180,000 Frenchmen just in France, getting ready to fight, that's a ton. And no one in, really recallable history in Europe has seen an army that big. And there was this raw manpower available to the French. It was just an order of magnitude beyond what the Allies could muster in their smaller professional armies. Fair enough. But the question remains, who was leading them, right? Who was leading all of these volunteers? Because we had this, and we've talked about this for many episodes, this mass exodus of the French officer corps after the National Assembly really got the ball rolling on things in the French Revolution. Who's leading them? Because we've talked about this steady stream of officers that had just, said, I'm out of here, we're done, and we're off to, emigrate somewhere else, largely to go find a Comte d'Artois. But this French officer corps exodus, which was a liability, had started to become an advantage. By this point, November 1792, every disaffected officer who was going to desert their post and defect, they'd pretty much done so, right? The officers who weren't in it for the French Revolution, they were gone. This meant that those who had stayed behind were true believers in the revolution, and they were committed to it. Those officers, and more importantly, the enlisted, the non-commissioned officers. Because remember, we talked about how they wanted to, in the 1770s and the 1780s in France, restrict the ability of anybody to go past the rank of captain, because that's where the nobility was supposed to be. They were the natural leaders, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's gone, right? That whole ceiling cap on your military career is gone. So there were experienced officers and non-commissioned officers who never could see their career go past captain, who all of a sudden saw that ceiling go, and they were promoted up. And these weren't new guys. These were people who had been career soldiers, who were experienced, and they were promoted on merit. So you have a captain who should be a captain, and a major who should be a major, and a brigadier who should be a brigadier. And you had experienced sergeants becoming lieutenants and captains and majors. And all of a sudden, this very depleted officer corps of the French army was filled to the brims, not only with good officers, but good officers who believed in the revolution. This reconstituted the officer corps with fully experienced and qualified men who were not secretly hoping that the Austrians would just come in and win. It instead packed the middle leadership of the army with individuals dedicated to the revolution, who had just been biding their time from within the army for a long time, and now were being promoted to an appropriate position of merit. So by the time... Oh, that didn't work right. I was supposed to pick somebody and it didn't. So by the time the French started pushing out after Valmy, the officers were experienced, dedicated, and passionately committed to the revolution. This combination of hyper-experienced and committed officer corps leading a hitherto before unseen in history, except for maybe the Roman Empire didn't have gunpowder. So this sort of army really hadn't been seen before in history. They were leading this never before seen mass of regular gunpowder infantry. It was a lethal combination. The officers they had and this new mass force. And if the Allies wanted to defeat it, they were going to need to start taking this whole war thing a whole lot more seriously than they really had to this point. And maybe stop letting Poland and Catherine the Great, we talked about that, being such a distraction out in the east. Because it had caused Prussia and Austria to pull troops over to their eastern flank when Catherine the Great said, I want a bigger chunk of Poland, and kind of make it into her own little hegemony. I'm talking about between the weaponry is you can draw a clear distinction in military forces historically between a pre-gunpowder era and a post-gunpowder era, right? You have the Roman Empire, as an example, was the manipul system. Was the phalanx, then the manipul system. The legion was rooted around spear and shield, right? And then the gladius later on. But there was no gunpowder there. And then as you go into the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, you're still talking about pikemen and horse infantry and knights. When gunpowder arrives and you get into the cuirassier and the winged hussar era, where troops of all stripes are carrying firearms, it changes everything, because no longer is the battle about getting as close as possible, holding your line, and just pushing until the other guys run. No, this is not the start of it, but it's an example of the difference between 180,000 French infantry carrying muskets is very different than 310,000 Roman infantry carrying three spears and a gladius and a shield. It's very different. So that's why I say, and I was more qualifying my comment that I was saying, it's the largest force that anyone's seen in a long time. 1,700 years. But it's also a very different big, because they're carrying around, you know, hammerlock, flintlock firearms. And it's this, just this mass, combined with this officer corps that no one really knew they had outside of France. That was something that was, the Allies, the Austrians and the Prussians just were not ready to stop. So, that's where things sit after the Battle of Jemappes. We got a whole lot more to talk about, because we got behind on the donation stuff, and that's fine. We're going to take our first break. When we come back, we're going to go back to Paris. We're going to talk about what is going on in the convention while that was relative to the war, right? We've talked about the convention for 3 straight weeks, about what was going on in September to, you know, February. But now we're going to talk about what they did completely with respect to the war. And then we'll talk about, and the British are on there for a reason. And I'm going to tell you this much before I go to break. Some of those flags at the top are going to move tonight. Which ones? You'll find out. But we'll be back. Stretch your legs. We've been going for an hour. Again, thank you so much for the generosity. $2,000 for Stop Soldier Suicide is amazing. And I really can't thank you all enough. But make sure you stand up. We've been sitting for a bit. Don't forget quiz at the end. And then don't forget to hang out with us all the way to the end, because we're going to see Omega and Permanoob and others play Phasmophobia for Extra Life right after the stream tonight. So I'll be right back. You guys make sure you stand up.
Excellent!
Yes, I'm excited about this.
Doof is on deck.
Dodson, we got Dodson here.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Let's rock!
So, welcome back. Hopefully you're back. So we're going to go change our focus here. You know, we've got the French victory at Jemappes. Decisive.
My lord!
Hey, Permanoob. We're going to come see you in a little while. So, with all this sudden victory, you know, we have all of Belgium at this point, all of a sudden. Sturf's here too. Sweet. Hey, Sturf. But with all this victory in their hands, the convention started to get a little giddy And in between debates over, the fate of the king, the whole conception of the war began to change within the convention. On November 19th, 1792, the convention issues the Decree of Fraternity, which essentially states that France would offer aid to any oppressed people looking to recover their lost liberty, which is effectively a bullseye on every monarchy everywhere. Since the beginning of the war, Jacques-Pierre Brissot's rhetoric had been hinting at this whole broader ideological theme beyond the war with Austria. And Brissot had pontificated spreading the gospel of the revolution, but until this point, that had just been, a whole lot of talk. But now that it appeared the revolutionary France may actually have the power to seize territory from its neighbors, the ideological side of the war began to be talked about more seriously politically. This shift in focus culminated with a further decree on December 15th. That stated revolutionary principles would be instituted in all, quote, liberated territories. And this further December the 5th decree stated that clerical and aristocratic lands were to be confiscated, and that tithes and feudal dues would be abolished, and new taxes would be imposed on the rich, and all government officials in these occupied, liberated lands must swear an oath to revolutionary principles. So we're going to march into your territories and blow up and take clerical and aristocratic lands and blow away your tithes and feudal dues and impose taxes on the rich, and all the government officials in place when we get there are going to have to swear an oath to all these principles that we've just outlined. And this put the revolution on a march. And no longer was it just an internal matter of France. Robespierre was his usual stand in the way of things himself about all of this. And this is, again, one of those moments where Maximilien Robespierre is kind of sane. He's like, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. He points out that all this enforcement of revolutionary ideals abroad may not work out like you guys think it's going to work out. Recall that the people of Belgium and the Austrian Netherlands had revolted against Austria when the Austrian emperor tried to reform the country. The Austrians saw a revolt in the Austrian Netherlands because they were trying to do progressive things. And now France was going far further and forcing the ideals of the revolution onto the Austrian Netherlands. Robespierre made this point that a French army imposing French principles probably isn't going to be wholeheartedly embraced by the citizens of the occupied, liberated territories. He further stated that, and this is the point that's really salient, quote, liberty can never be founded upon the use of foreign force, end quote. Which is a lesson that we need to learn in our modern times. That no matter how much Western democracies want to go spread that out into the world, you can't do it by force. It's never going to stick, is what Robespierre's point is. It has to be like Inception. You have to have the idea yourself as a country. Hey, democracy sounds great. Yeah, let's do it. But when you're doing it at the barrel of a gun, it's never going to work. Yeah. So again, it's one of those moments where you look back, 200 years, and there's a crazy person making this point, because Robespierre's crazy. You're going to see how crazy in a little bit. But Robespierre is kind of nuts, but he does have the concepts down, which is why so many people still look back to him and go, hey, he was a bloody murderer, but he did make some really good points. And this is one of them. There is a muster happening in chat, everybody. However, as ideology began to take a larger role in the French desire to liberate, quote, liberate territory from its enemies, there was a much simpler national interest at stake, which was now being openly discussed. France wanted to secure its natural borders. And if you look at a relief map of Europe, which I'm not going to put up here, it's really easy to tell where France's natural borders are in the minds of the French.
No way.
Yes way. The Alps to the southeast, the Mediterranean to the south, the Pyrenees Mountains to the southwest, which bordered the Iberian Peninsula, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, the English Channel to the north, and the Rhine River to the east. Now, the Rhine River sits on the other side of Belgium. Of these 6 borders, only the Rhine was really left to be secured, and with those German principalities now stormed and Belgium in hand, it really was down to if the French could peel off the required Dutch territory to reach the Rhine River in the Dutch lowlands and complete this circuit of what they believed to be the natural borders. And that push into the Dutch lowlands, we're going to get to tonight, and it's going to be the thing that turns the tide against General Demouriez. But before we get there, we have to talk about the British. This brings us to the United Kingdom, who had worked so very hard to remain neutral so far, and at this point just can't avoid getting sucked into the war. The provocations for the British
Bogus.
started pretty much the moment General Demouriez crossed into Belgium. Remember, and we've talked about this, that the only reasons the Austrians held on to the Austrian Netherlands, this territory they continuously tried to trade at every treaty negotiation, was because that the British, as their ally, had in the past said, we want you to have that, so France doesn't have that. Well, now France has it. All through the 18th century, British foreign policy had centered on keeping the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands in the British sphere of political and economic influence and away from the French. So you're going to see a guy top right on the grid of people, and that's William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt the Elder was someone we've talked about before, but William Pitt the Younger is, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain. And despite William Pitt's fervent desire to remain neutral, the French invasion of Belgium put him into a bind. The first officially provocative action came November 16, 1792, when the French declared freedom of navigation on the Scheldt River, which the Dutch held an exclusive claim to since the end of the 30 Years' War back in 1648. And it's not that the access to the river was a big deal, right? The Scheldt River is something that, even going back to Louis XIV, they've been trying to make deals about. But the Scheldt River estuary was not, access to it wasn't the problem for the British. The problem was that the French pretty much just had a flagrant disregard for a century-and-a-half old treaty obligation. Like, this is what the treaty says. Everyone involved agreed to it. Now here comes the French stomping on that document. That was Britain's problem. Shortly after that, November 16th, when the French declared freedom of navigation on the Scheldt River estuary, the Austrians were entirely evacuating Belgium and French forces were able to advance to the borders of those united Dutch provinces, which are today the Netherlands. The Dutch, seeing the French at their border, started, jumping up and down, saying, "Oh, somebody help me!" And it looked like the British were probably now going to have to provide that help. Yeah, Maz's point's right. But it was agreed to by the French monarchy, not the French people, and I see the argument. Yeah, but it's the principle, right? The way in which governments, for instance, we'll use the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian Federation assumed all the debts of the Soviet Union, right? They couldn't just write it all off. There had to be some body that inherited all the debt, treaty obligations, etc. Because otherwise, you just have a rogue state out there, doing whatever it wants, ignoring what everyone else says. If you don't have that transition of obligation, then things are really bad. And that's what France is doing here. They're going, we don't care what the king said, down with the king. We don't care what the king, a century and a half said either. And it's a problem for not just Britain, but everybody. It's a problem for the world when that happens. Then and now. But again, the Dutch start jumping up and down. They say, hey, somebody, anybody want to help us? And the British are probably on the hook for that. This was, of course, unless they wanted to wake up in a few days and discover that revolutionary France now controlled the entire coast of the continent which faced the British Isles, which they didn't want that. But luckily for William Pitt, the slow turn from neutrality towards war was generally supported back home in Britain. Many of the liberty-loving Brits had cheered the French Revolution on when it had started, and in contemporary terms at the time, the people of Britain had a fair amount of liberty compared to where everybody else was. And even those opposed to it in Britain, at the outset, didn't really see any reason to get involved in the madness that was unfolding in France. But after the insurrection of August the 10th, and even more so after the September massacres, it changed all of that sentiment and turned British public opinion decisively against the French Revolution. So now William Pitt knew if he took Britain to war, he was on pretty firm political footing to do so. But Pitt's emissaries continued to negotiate with France to avoid the war. But when the convention executed Louis XVI in the early days of 1793, the British just stopped talking to them. Entirely. Like, it would be the modern day equivalent of cutting off diplomatic relations. And because of that, get a load of this one, because of that, the National Convention, because they believed they were invincible after Jemappes, right? Here's Valmy, here's Jemappes, we own all of Belgium now, no one can stop us. They preemptively declared war on Britain. The French declared war on Britain on February 1st, 1793. Told you we'd move a flag tonight. I'll space that out better later. So there's Britain, over there, now at war with France. But here's the thing. It didn't... Yeah. So, of course, first, that the French position was not as invincible as the National Convention believed it was after the successes of the fall and into the winter of 1792. And especially wasn't that invincible now that they had just poked the Brits in the eye. Because there were the Brits. They said... They probably took a step back and said, whoa, you guys just killed your king. That's a 1,000-year-old monarchy. We had the wrong conception of who we were dealing with. We probably need to take a step back diplomatically and figure out what we want to do here. But instead, the convention said, oh yeah, if you're not going to call us anymore, we're going to war with you. That was the response to the convention. And it didn't take long for British diplomats, who were way better at their job at this point in history than their French counterparts, to just start talking to everybody else and draw a nice circle around France and, tell Spain and Sardinia and Naples, which is basically Italy, hey, they're a problem. We are your commercial ally. Maybe we should all do something about that. So all of a sudden, here's Britain saying, let's get Spain over here. Sardinia, Naples are too small for me to have a flag up there for, by the way. So there are only two other great powers in Europe at this time who are not at war with France. And Spain really isn't a great power. They're a second-tier power at this point in history. But still kind of a big deal that pretty much overnight, the National Convention says, we'll fight you too because we can't be beaten. And they're going to find out really quickly that they can be beaten. To this point, the French Revolutionary armies had enjoyed the advantage of being underestimated, right? Prussia and Austria had done it, and they'd paid for it, and there's France controlling Belgium. But it's not a mistake that the Allies, now including Britain and Spain and Sardinia and Naples, are going to keep on making, right? The world knows this isn't just some dispute about what's happening inside France, but this is a continental war, and that changes everything. But for the record, The entire set of campaigns that we've been talking about from 1792 to 1797 will be collectively known as that First War of the Coalition. We've used that term before. It was the name of an episode back in the spring of 1792 whenever we kicked off the whole war. But it bears repeating now as the coalition just grown significantly. It will be followed down the road by the Second War of the Coalition, the War of the Second Coalition, and the War of the Third Coalition, which will bridge us from the Revolutionary to the Napoleonic era. But this war, which Brissot started when the Legislative Assembly took their seats, is going to stretch all the way to the Treaty of Vienna. After Napoleon's surrender in Paris in 1814, 23 years of pretty much continuous warfare. And even though the War of the First Coalition is dated back to the spring of 1792, as we discussed in episode 1.15, when the Austrians and Prussia went to war with France, it's really here that the first pan-European alliance against revolutionary France emerges. Like, you see all these powers in France kind of setting down their differences and saying, we need to do something about that. And they're all going, yep. So speaking of a pan-European war effort, we have to again speak about the special role that Poland plays in all of this. I wore a Polish t-shirt tonight just because I get to talk about Poland. One of the reasons that Prussia had been so quick to pull out of France after Valmy, and the Austrians as well, was because the Russians had gone into Poland. And Frederick William II pretty much prioritized that eastern flank over his western flank. However, as aggressive as Catherine the Great of Russia was, she was not looking to get into a heavyweight fight with the Prussian armies, now massing on her border. So in January 1793, Catherine the Great proposes what is known to history as the Second Partition of Poland. This is how Poland disappears from the map, by the way. This whole series of partitions. Eventually, there will be no Poland. And there will be no Poland until the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. So this second partition of Poland was signed on January 23rd, 1793. And it saw the Russians claim the majority of Polish territory, with the Prussians receiving the strategically helpful slice, which kind of helped shore up their eastern borders. And this left the Polish Commonwealth just 1/3 the size it had been prior to the first partition in 1772, which we kind of discussed initially in our first overview of Europe at the outset of the Revolution. But the big point here for our story that we're telling about the French Revolution is that the Prussians no longer had a distraction on their eastern front. And they could now turn their full attention back to the French. So come the spring of 1793, essentially all of Europe, pretty much, and the Russians and the Ottomans are sitting outside of it, but pretty much all of Europe is going to be arrayed against France, which will again turn the fortunes of war. The other thing that helped turn the tables against the French at this point was that it turned out Robespierre was absolutely right. And I know whenever I said it, everyone's like, that makes complete sense. He's right. Liberty can never be founded on the use of foreign force. All of the people in the recently occupied/liberated territories quickly discovered that the liberating French army sure looked like a regular old occupation. The French soldiers who were in their midst made themselves right at home, taking what they wanted, drinking what they wanted, and sleeping where they wanted, whenever they wanted. And those French decrees dating back to the outset of war, which guaranteed that French forces would always respect the liberty, lives, and property of the people they liberated. Remember that? Remember that whole thing back in spring of 1792? It looked like a whole lot of smoke to the people who now found themselves occupied, not liberated. Nowhere was this problem more apparent than in Belgium. Demouriez's men again had spread themselves out throughout Belgium, throughout the entire Belgian countryside. and were acting as if every farmhouse was their own personal supply depot. Now, that's not to say that's weird. That happens pretty much in every war. No, it has nothing to do with being spread too thin. They just had fanned out everywhere. And so every single farmhouse and every single little village and every single little house became the personal, just, I'll take that, for every single French soldier. There's a scene in Band of Brothers where this happens, where two of the soldiers of the Easy Company are inside I believe it's a Dutch farmhouse, and they're just in there picking the eggs up out of the chicken coop like they're theirs, and they find beer wherever they want and they drink it. That's just what happens in war, right? Part of that is because armies are told to live off the land, and that's what that is. That's living off the land. Part of that is because armies tend to plunder. That's not new here. Armies have plundered forever. There actually used to be a rule back in antiquity, back in the Greek and Roman times and the Persian times. It's like, basically, if our army rolls up to your city, which probably has walls because they all had walls back then, we'll negotiate. And if you negotiate and surrender, we probably won't enslave all of you. We probably won't take everything you own. But if a siege engine touches your walls, all bets are off. You're all going to be enslaved and raped, and everything that you have is ours. And it was an understood universal rule in Mediterranean antiquity that was a thing that was going to happen. So you either said, yeah, we give up, or you rolled the dice on your ability to withstand a siege. So the point is that this isn't new. The French army rolling through Belgium, taking what they wanted, sleeping where they wanted, doing what they wanted, whenever they wanted, is how armies have largely conducted themselves for, 2,500 years. And further back to where we have no record. The bigger problem is that the French had made decrees saying, we're going to respect your stuff when we get to your country, should we ever have to go there. We'll respect your property and your liberty and your lives, and then they didn't. Again, Demouriez's men are spread out throughout Belgium at this point. There's a ton of them, and the Allies have withdrawn. There's no Allied force in Belgium, so they're just out there fortifying all the positions that the Austrians and the Prussians had given up. And they again turned everything into their own little supply depot. And the National Convention's December 15th decree, which imposed those revolutionary principles, meant that when the French soldiers showed up in your town, they not only took everything that was not nailed down, but they also desecrated churches, seized aristocratic property, and generally spit on every tradition, principle, and practice that made you who you were. And guess what? That's how every invading army acts. Again, remember the prior Belgian revolt against the Austrians a few years earlier, where the Belgians were not trying to overthrow Austria, but prevent reforms which they saw as threatening to those traditions and principles and practices, which made them who they were. So relations between the local Belgians and the occupying French got really bad, really quick. And so recognizing that things were, maybe not going so smoothly in Belgium, the convention dispatched Georges Danton himself up to Brussels to get a handle on things. And his departure to the front in December 1792 is the reason he played almost no role in the main debate on the fate of the king. Because he's not there. Remember that trial kicks off pretty much day after Christmas? He's not there. One of the reasons, though, that Danton was sent is because doubts were starting to bubble up, creep in, about General Demouriez's true loyalties. Sure.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Demouriez's success in the field was undeniable and publicly celebrated. However, it was pretty clear that he had his own agenda. He kind of felt himself, leader of his own thing and not really beholden to the convention. Demouriez was known to not be all that happy about anything that had happened in Paris over the past year, including the insurrection, the massacres, the trial, and the execution of the king. So after Demouriez ran the Austrians out of Belgium, the convention started to receive some troubling reports about what Demouriez was up to. He was apparently aligning himself with local conservatives in Belgium and talking openly about raising an army of Belgium, composed of local volunteers and funded by grants from the local Catholic Church, which that will raise some eyebrows to those who have revolutionary principles. This all looked like Demouriez was trying to turn Belgium into some sort of personal little power base, which God knows what he might do with it. So Danton was sent up there to assist with the liberation, which really was, go find out what the hell Demouriez is up to and make sure it's not setting up some sort of local power base to do God knows what with. So Danton arrives, and Demouriez chafes under this supervision because he's not the kind of guy. Remember, he used to be Minister of War. He chafes under Danton's presence, and it leads him to develop further resentment about the course of the French Revolution. So despite the supreme confidence that they had, the convention now seemed to have... let me rephrase this. Despite the supreme confidence the convention now seemed to have about the inevitability of French victory, they did realize they couldn't just sit back and be like, hey, look, we won a couple of battles. We can't be beaten. All right, that was General Robert Lee's problem in Civil War. For one thing, now that the immediate emergency prior to Valmy of Paris being sacked had been lifted, a ton of those soldiers who had said, I'll go fight, kind of assumed they'd done their job to save the nation, and they started to desert and come home as the advance went further and further and further up into the Low Countries. Day by day, France began to lose its overwhelming numerical advantage. If you've never been to Gettysburg, go. I've been to Gettysburg. It's fantastic. It's an amazing historical place. Really cool. Guys there are impeccable and knowledgeable. But again, now that the threat had been lifted to the city of Paris, those guys who ran out there after the September massacres are kind of like, well, job's done. And they started to say, I'm going home. And that massive order of magnitude advantage of numbers that the French had started to drip, drip, drip to desertion. Even though the armies had fought pretty well, obviously, I mean, they had a 3-1 advantage, but they had fought pretty well. This new kind of national army that the French had was going to need a structural overhaul to work properly. That potent mix of adrenaline and enthusiasm had temporarily carried the day for the revolutionary armies at Valmy and Jemappes and moving into Belgium proper. But if they were going to keep moving forward, they were going to have to become better organized. So shortly after the declaration of war with Britain in February 1793, the military committee, because there is such a thing, remember there's no executive right now, right? There's no executive in French government. It's all committees that are kind of spun off of the National Convention, kind of making decisions. But this military committee of the National Convention reported back on a reorganization known as the Amalgame. It's Amalgame. It's the French derivative of the word amalgam, which means combining unlike things. The thrust of the Amalgame was as follows. 1. Make sure that these new volunteers who come into the army are paired with veterans. veterans who have been on the line and fought. We don't want clusters of green troops just working within a unit. We don't want battalions filled up with nothing but green troops. Specifically, brigades would be organized on the principle of basically one veteran battalion for two battalions of volunteers. And it wasn't like, here's your 2 battalions of volunteers and here's your 1 battalion of veterans. They were integrated with each other. But the mixture was basically 2 to 1. There was 2 volunteers for every 1 veteran within a brigade. And a brigade is made of, 3 battalions. For the French army at this time anyway. We're going to get to that too. How Napoleon introduced the corps system that everyone uses today. We'll get to that when we get to Napoleon too. Because that's another big impact. This whole intermix of veterans with green raw volunteers would assure assimilation more quickly of these new recruits into the daily reality of military life, right? And trust me, that's the thing. I remember when I was, 21 years old and I went off to join the United States Air Force and I was like, I'm going to serve my country. And I got to basic training. I was like, wow. Just wow. It's a shock. Just put it that way. And then once you get out of that and you're actually in the field doing the job, it's holy crap. And it's a shock. And if you don't have a seasoned, sergeant or at least another bunch of corporals sitting there saying, in my case, more senior airmen saying, this is life and this is how this life works, it's going to be hard to integrate. So you're talking about a state where there are not systems in place to make sure that integration is really smooth. The French are beginning to do that here. They're beginning to say, how do we correctly integrate new recruits with veterans? It's not just that discipline is a shock. Discipline's discipline. It's way more than discipline. Discipline's an aspect of it for sure. But you go from a situation where you have pretty much agency for your own life, right? You are able to do what you want to do generally. You have to go do a job. You got to pay your bills or whatever. But you don't have... You give up almost to a degree ownership of your life when you serve in the military. People can tell you what to do, and your response is yes, sir, or ma'am. Right? I mean, there's a reason why doctors in the military don't have to carry malpractice insurance, because they were just following an order, and you were just following an order by having the surgery done. It really is that. You give up that personal liberty when you become a member of the military. France is recognizing that here. They're going, okay, these aren't career professional soldiers. These guys are guys that are going up and saying, I want to fight for France, Mom! And they're running out the door, not realizing what they're volunteering for. And that's the reason they're running home. The only way to make sure they don't run home is to ensure the transition into the force is one they can understand. Yeah, Manny's got it. You go from being able to do what you want to do when you want to being told when to eat, when to sleep, what to wear. Everything. Especially early on. In the Army and Marine Corps, it's that way all the time. So this whole amalgame ensured this quick assimilation. So then, of course, once the battle begins, once a fight actually breaks out, the presumably less fidgety veterans would keep their greener, newer brother-in-arms on the line and fighting and prevent a mass panic like had happened before, but with veterans, from sweeping the lines, right? Because the moment 20 guys are like, holy crap, I'm out of here, that could domino down a line of infantry in this point in history. So these veterans are basically there to put their boot and the boot of the guy to the right and left firmly in the ground and say, we're not going anywhere. So these reforms of the French army will eventually be implemented to great effect, right? You can all see the logic of it. It's like one of the smartest things a convention does. But, yep, how to think too. But these reforms will not be implemented fast enough to stave off the coming disasters for the French in the spring of 1793. So this is another hugely important point, both for tonight and for next week. Get a drink real quick. So to make up for this steady loss of troops, because remember, these reforms of integration between veterans and green soldiers are not in place yet, a big new recruitment push was announced on February 24th, 1793, which history knows which history knows as the levy of 300,000. And this is exactly what it sounds like. The French army needs 300,000 more soldiers right now. Critically, though, the convention, while they wanted these 300,000 troops or volunteers to voluntarily join the army, they recognized that might not happen. And they authorized impressment into service where and when necessary, which is effectively like a draft, except at the point of a gun. The historical significance of this decree has less to do with its impact on the war effort, but more its impact on a specific region of France, which didn't really feel like volunteering for service and were really not about to let, bullies from Paris force them into the army. And I'm, of course, speaking here about the long foreshadowed Vandee region, which it's the green stripy area on your map there. It's not all of that, but it's over there. It's south of Brittany. We're going to talk about that at length next week, about how France not only sees this coalition of enemies external, but the beginnings of an internal civil revolt from those who never really supported the revolution at all in the first place. Now, the levy of 300,000 isn't going to be popular in a lot of places, but eventually people kind of get in line, except in the Vandee. In the Vandee, we're going to explain this more next week, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back from the perspective of a revolution they didn't love. And they went from kind of being passively resistant to the revolution to going and finding all the sharp things they could. It'll be a major part of how the revolution plays out over the course of the next few years, because this is not an internal revolt that the French are going to be able to go in their boot stomp and be done with. It's going to take years to settle matters in the Vandee. But for the record, the people in the Vandee are super Catholic and have been super pissed about the anti-clerical activities of the revolution, going back to the civil constitution, stripping lands from the church to back bonds. So the levy of 300,000 will just be the spark that lights the massive pile of alcohol-soaked rags which have been building in the Vandee since 1789. This is not where the phrase the levy breaks comes from, but I see what you're trying to do. So, unfortunately for the French, none of their military reorganization or troop conscription efforts, again, were going to be kicking in fast enough, right, to save them once the fighting recommenced in the spring. We're going to get to that fighting in the spring, what happens to the French army and Demouriez after we take a break. We've got about an hour here with what's left in content and the quiz before we kick things over to the Omega Jake and Permanu playing Phasmophobia for Extra Life tonight. But again, we've been going for about another... I like to take breaks about every 45 minutes during history because there's a lot of talking, and I want to give brains a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about, okay, now the French have Belgium, and they've been losing troops here and there. And none of this stuff that the French National Convention realizes is important to keeping the army going is going to be in place in time, and then Demouriez is going to make a mistake. A big one. a big strategic mistake, and you're gonna hear it and be like, why? We'll get to that in a couple minutes. Stretch, go to the bathroom, get a drink, all that stuff, and I'll talk to you in just a few minutes. Once I press a button.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Let's rock!
Welcome back. Two things before we get rolling again. First of all, next Saturday will be book giveaway day. So make sure you've got those tributes in your pocket prior to the stream next Saturday if you want to get in. I haven't picked the book yet. Sorry. I'm still kind of considering my options. We gave away Hero of Two Worlds to Rocket. We gave away The Black Count to Dustin, which is about Alexandre Dumas' father Charles during the Napoleonic era. I'm going to pick another relevant book, obviously, to the French Revolution. I just haven't picked it out yet. But it'll be there, and you guys will get your shot at it next Saturday. The other thing is I'm teaching myself how to use this thing, which I can get to face the camera, would be awesome. This thing is an astrolabe, which actually, you know, turns and whatever. But what it is, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of work. An astrolabe is what was used, especially in the Ottoman Empire, to tell time based on the orientation of the stars. As long as you're on a flat piece of land or fairly stable seas, you could use your position and the position of the stars to orient what time it was. I'm going to teach myself how to use it because it tickles two things for me. It tickles the whole history vibe and it tickles the whole space vibe. So I picked it up. It's really pretty. And once I figure out how people, hundreds of years ago told time with the stars, maybe I'll teach some other people. I guess it didn't work much during the day. No. I mean, you could tell by sometimes where, what the sun is, etc., but doesn't live on flat. Flat as in it's not waves, rocket, solid ground. But I want to teach myself how to use it, so I picked one up. I picked one up from an artisan in Greece, and that was what I got. I got it because I wanted to also have something that was, pretty firm. It reminded me of my two passions, and it's a very great symbol. It's small enough to be a keychain, a big keychain, but it's still, if I put it around my neck in comparison to everything else, it is on a chain, but it sits inside of my journal. It's about, that big. It's pretty big. Except astrolabe is not the name of a thing. It's an astrolabe. But I digress. Again, unfortunately for the French, none of these reorganizational efforts, conscription efforts, were going to, LABE, were going to kick in fast enough, right, to save them once fighting started again in the spring. But still supremely confident, Demouriez took the declaration of war with Britain as a signal that he ought to get going with the next phase of his grand plan. The invasion of the United Dutch Provinces, the Netherlands, up there to the north of the map, which we today call the Netherlands. And again, the reason was, hey, let's go secure that natural border of France. Unfortunately, this focus on advancing north to link up, it led Demouriez to miss an opportunity to link up with French forces advancing along the Rhine to his east, to push the Austrians who were evacuating out of Belgium completely across the river. And this is the thing, because you see where Cologne is on the map here, right up here on the border of the Holy Roman Empire, this city here called Cologne. The Austrian forces had largely retreated to Cologne after the Battle of, Jemappes and then the surrender of Mons. But they hadn't retreated across the river. They continued to gather on the west bank of the river, precluding the need for when they decided to come back into Belgium proper, they would not need to make a river crossing in combat. Now, for those of you that understand even World War II history, you understand that these rivers are not the sort of rivers you just wade across. You don't send your troops over them. You have to go across the bridge. All right, let's do this. I detest dad jokes. Take that, right? But these rivers are not the sort of rivers that you send they're not shallow enough to send an infantry force just walking through. You have to make bridge crossings, which is why in World War II, finding that bridge to cross the Rhine was so important, because it would have allowed the Allies to spill into Germany, right? So the French didn't force the Austrians and the Prussians onto the other side of the Rhine. They were able to stand on the west bank of the Rhine outside of Cologne and mass their forces there. And it meant that instantly the Austrians were going to be able to be mobile. They couldn't be bottled up. They could, the moment they said forward march, go where they wanted. With the French armies in Belgium numbering close to 120,000 soldiers, though, it's likely that Demouriez thought the Austrians would never really be able to just push their way back in to Belgium. And so on February 16, 1793, he personally led a force of 20,000 up into Dutch territory, which is now known, this force is known as the Army of Belgium. It's not that same Army of Belgium that the National Convention and Danton were kind of concerned about. It's a French army called the Army of Belgium. He marched almost due north, and he quickly captured a string of small fortresses before getting ready for the big push that he was going to make, which would take him to Rotterdam, The Hague, and then the big jewel, Amsterdam. But while Demouriez made this run up the coast, his eastern flank was supposed to be supported by a portion of Demouriez's larger army of the north, now under the command of General Francisco de Miranda. And that's a very Spanish name, but that's not uncommon. There's been a lot of Spanish-French alliances throughout history here. General Miranda had a force about 10,000 strong that was supposed to effectively move up along the right side of Demouriez and just protect that flank as he made his move into the Dutch lowlands. Miranda was ordered to capture Maastricht, which is up in the Netherlands, and then join Demouriez.
Remember to clunk that follow button.
Miranda ran into a problem at Maastricht. On February 21st, he encountered much stiffer resistance than he expected to, and he had to lay siege to the town. No one likes a siege, especially raw recruits who have never done it before in the middle of a Dutch winter. So the French volunteers who had been drip, deserting started to desert faster. And because of this, the siege of Maastricht was abandoned on March 3rd, which was the beginning of the bad news for the French armies. The siege of Maastricht was abandoned in part because that Austrian army, which had gathered on the west side of the Rhine, near Cologne, said forward march and started marching west. And they were now something close to 40,000 strong. And that Allied army smashed a much smaller French army at Oudenhoven on March 1st. And they were looking deadly serious about retaking Belgium. And remember, Demouriez and Miranda are up north. They're not in Belgium. They have advanced into the Netherlands. So with this Allied army now on the move back into Belgium, the convention ordered Demouriez to abandon his Dutch campaign and instead to lead the defense of Belgium. Now, Demouriez was who he was. He wasn't happy at all about being bossed around by the convention, but for the moment he did what he was told and he headed south. Now, again, if he had just decided to push this force over the Rhine into the Holy Roman Empire completely, he would have had his full left flank available to sweep into the Dutch lowlands later. But he chose to go into the Netherlands first, probably out of a little bit of arrogance. So Demouriez arrived back in Brussels on March 11th, took command of the 45,000 or so men who had all rendezvoused there to face the Austrians, and that set up that, well, what happens when the odds are even? Because 40,000 Austrians and Prussians and 45,000 French, and all of a sudden it's a 1-to-1 fight. So upon taking command, Demouriez had two pretty paradoxical thoughts in his head. First, he had this conception that his army was invincible, right? The great mistake all generals who haven't lost yet in the 18th and 19th century make. They haven't lost yet, must mean I can't be beaten. And he just figured he'd whip the Austrians. But he also knew that if he ordered any kind of withdrawal, that his invincible army would likely disintegrate, right? They just disintegrate into a panic flight. Because here are all these, it's largely raw still. It's just a numbers game. If he said, we're out of here, those volunteers are likely to go, well, what? I thought we couldn't lose, you said so, and run. So there was only one thing to do. Demouriez orders his army to take it to advance and meet the Austrians head on, which would place them a long line nearly centered on the Belgian town of Neerwinden. And this is where Neerwinden is in March 1793. This guy right here. You can't see. It's right in the middle. It's that Red Cross swords. Red Cross swords, by the way, bad for France. Blue Cross swords, good for France. Demouriez divided his forces into 8 columns, and he identified the Austrian left as the weakest point. At dawn on March 18th, he ordered 3 of those 8 columns on a flanking maneuver, which took all morning, but the French forces successfully took the high ground along with the town of Neerwinden, and even managed to hold off at least one Austrian attempt to retake those positions they had just claimed. However, further Austrian attacks and bombardments forced the French to give up those positions. No worries, Rocket. So the French advanced on the left, and then they were repulsed back out of those positions on the left. Now the Austrians rehold that left. So then it was the French's turn to try and retake those positions, but their successive attempts of just rolling up these rookie troops, largely still rookie troops, onto these held and dug in Austrian positions, they failed. And those French forces that were over there on the left had to retreat. Meanwhile, on the Austrian right, the French left, the day had been spent largely skirmishing around and not a whole lot of actual close engagement. But late in the day, the Austrians launched a hard cavalry charge against what was clearly to them a fatigued French infantry. This charge turned into an utter rout of that French infantry on the French left, and it saw the French left collapse. Here's the thing. Demouriez didn't find out that his left had collapsed until the next morning. His entire left had fallen apart. And when he found out, he had no choice. He was being outflanked now. He had to order a general retreat. So it's effectively this fight between these two wings. No real fighting took place in the center, but that's how these infantry fights happen. That's how a lot of battles have happened up to this point in history. Turn a flank and you win. And the Austrians turned to flank. The Battle of Neerwinden finally represented that evenly matched fight for the French armies, and the French had been beaten and run on all fronts. To make matters worse, the retreat triggered mass desertion as the men, those volunteers who had now began to run, they just kept running all the way home. They just ran all the way back to France, back home. It was just like Demouriez feared. Within days, Demouriez was leading only 20,000 men. He had 45,000 at Neerwinden. Less than half of what he had just a few days prior. His retreating army lost another engagement March 21st to an Austrian army that now outnumbered the French 2-1. But Demouriez still managed to extract himself back through Brussels. But by now, he was starting to form a completely new concept of what his next move should be. As Demouriez passed through Brussels, he opened negotiations with the Austrians, and his terms were simple. You can have Belgium back. Have the whole territory back as long as you allow me to withdraw all of my forces back to France unmolested. And the Austrians were like, yeah, that sounds great. They agreed to those terms. They even allowed a French army, which was trapped behind the Allied lines, to pass through the Allied lines unmolested. But the reason for Austrian leniency was also due to the hints Demouriez was dropping about what he planned to do when he got back to France. Demouriez was pretty much set on his next move being the turning of his armies around and no longer facing the Allies, but facing back at Paris, marching on Paris, breaking the National Convention, and restoring the Constitution of 1791. Don't know who'd be king under that Constitution, but that was his plan. The convention got wind of all these defeats, right? Neerwinden and a couple days later. And so they sent a delegation up to ask Demouriez what the hell's going on, demanding an explanation for the loss at Neerwinden and the total evacuation of Belgium. And here's what happened. When they arrived in Demouriez's camp on April 4th, General Demouriez did not make any attempt to pretend that he was still on their side. He arrested them the entire delegation and just handed them over to the Austrians. This delegation included the current French Minister of War. However, Demouriez totally underestimated the loyalty of his officers to the cause instead of him. None of his officers really thought highly of the politicians in the convention, but none of them were about to march on Paris and restore the monarchy under the blessing of the Austrians. So, unable to convince his men to follow him, all of Demouriez's plans fell apart, and like so many others before him, it was his time to slip across the Austrian lines and emigrate. So here he is, General Demouriez, who we've been talking about off and on for a while. He's done. He's going to go hang out in Austria now. He's done leading French armies. But take a look at the left column, center row. There is someone there named Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. That young man was also in the party that went over with General Demouriez. He was 22 years old, and he was son of the current Duc d'Orléans. And you'll remember that the Duc d'Orléans has been a thorn, or had been a thorn in the side of the royal family since before this all got going. He owned the Palais Royal. He allowed free press to exist within the Palais Royal. There had always been conspiracy theories about what the Duc d'Orléans' intentions actually were. He was at the Assembly of Notables, and he'd, been elected to several legislative bodies that have run their course throughout our history here. And he had restyled himself Citizen Philippe Égalité. This is his son, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. This is the eventual future Duc d'Orléans. And when we get to the July monarchy, this is the future King Louis-Philippe I of France. In one of those great what-if moments, what if Louis-Philippe had not decided to emigrate with Demouriez right now? What if he had stayed? The Great Terror is right around the corner. Lots of aristocrats are going to die. What if he had decided to say, no, I'm going to stay in France. I don't want to go with you. But he goes. And he's going to be in exile for a long time. But eventually, after the restoration and after that fails,
Yes, I'm excited about this.
that's probably what would have happened to him. But eventually, this 22-year-old man who's being mentioned for the first time tonight, and then it's just going to go poof and disappear right back out of our story, he's going to be King of France one day in our narrative. So this is obviously all really bad news for the revolutionaries in Paris, as they now again are facing an imminent Austrian and Prussian invasion, which is why they must have been super excited to hear that out there in western France, an armed uprising had broken out in the Vandee in response to the levy of 300,000. Not only had they gone to war with Britain, which triggered Spain to go to war with them, and thought they had everything handled in Belgium, and now they're back in French territory holding the frontier. And here come the Austrians, and here come the Spanish down in the Pyrenees, and who knows what the British are up to, but holy crap, inside our borders is a popular revolt. Next week, we will explore the origins of that revolt, which is known to history as the War in the Vendée. This uprising will threaten to destroy France from the inside, right at the time that her enemies are all knocking on her borders again. This time bolstered by a much wider coalition of most of Europe ready to take down revolutionary France. And then we're also going to talk about next week the Enragés, however you want to pronounce it, who were the leaders of the Sans-Culottes. Remember, they're still a thing, right? They're still watching everything the National Convention does. They were the big force behind the insurrection of August the 10th? Well, the Demouriez are the more fanatical leaders of the sans-culottes, which we haven't really talked about right now, until now. We're going to get into them and how they, again, try to start yet another popular uprising within Paris to topple the government. And that attempt will be mollified by the convention in a way history recalls as the Purge of the Girondins. That'll be 2 weeks from now.
No way!
Yes, way. So that's what we're looking for to the end of October, early November, and then the second week in November probably is when we get to the terror in earnest. Like the real holy crap side of the Reign of Terror. But we have a quiz to do. Once I find the quiz button. Don't forget how to play the quiz. Once I find where I put my quiz questions. Alright, there are 10 questions on the quiz tonight as always. Everyone has a chance to answer. You must start your answer with exclamation point, answer, space, and then your answer. Your answer goes into a file. As long as you get it in before the 1 minute timer completes, we'll read it on the stream, and if you get it right, you get a point. Get it wrong, nothing happens to you. Take a shot. Be mature. Don't put anything stupid in the answer file. Take a shot at getting the right answer. At the end of season 2, which will probably end at the end of our French Revolution series, we will award some swag from the shop to the winner and maybe some others. So here we go. The first question for tonight. 60 seconds on the clock starts after I finish. Explain why the French officer corps, which had been a liability prior to the Battle of Jemappes, was now an advantage. And let me fix a typo, and here you go, go. Don't forget, exclamation point answer, space your answer. You have 55 seconds. Explain why the French officer corps, which had been a liability prior to the Battle of Jemappes, was now an advantage. 40 seconds on the clock. Exclamation point answer, and then your answer. Rocket has her answer in. Moderators, as always, I know you can see the answers. Play fairly. 22 seconds left. Sturf gets her answer in. Explain why the French officer corps, which had been a liability prior to the Battle of Jemappes, was now an advantage. 15 seconds left. Five seconds. All right, we have 2 answers on the first question. Let's see what Rocket says. Manny maybe got in time. I think the clock went down first. All the captains that had just hit the ceiling due to being non-nobility were now allowed to advance to the rank and file in the empty spaces. That is part of the correct answer. Good enough. It also included the non-commissioned officers, but Rocket got the gist of it. That is correct. The next answer from Sturfers. They had experienced soldiers. That is not correct. That is not correct. It has nothing to do with the officer corps. It was about the crux of that group who had wanted nothing to do with it. They were gone, and now the army was beginning to promote into the officer corps on merit. Let's see what the next one was. Let's see. Dustin got one in. The officers started filling up the ranks, making a much more experienced army. That is the gist of it as well. Dustin gets it. And he's on the leaderboard. And did anybody else answer? That is the end of the valid answers. So anyone else after that point? They began advancing the ranks to the ranks they should be. That is the correct answer, but you were after the buzzer, Manny. And I've given you leniency on it in the past. Got to be quicker at this point. Kind of gave you your freebie on that one last week and the week before. The second question of tonight's quiz. 60 seconds on the clock. As soon as I finish, what was the primary reason General Demouriez had to be confident about his initial invasion of Belgium / the Austrian Netherlands? 60 seconds starts now. What was the primary reason General Demouriez had to be confident about his initial invasion of Belgium, or as it was also known, the Austrian Netherlands? 50 seconds left. "35 seconds. What was the primary reason General Demouriez had to be confident about his initial invasion of Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands?" Rocket says she thinks I got it wrong, but he answered. Manny's in there with an answer. 5 seconds left. Dustin gets in. No worries, Rocket. But I didn't state that one while you were on the phone. It was much earlier in the quiz. First answer comes to us from, or in the episode. Miranda was covering him on his left. No, that was not the initial invasion of Belgium. That was the invasion of the Dutch lowlands. He didn't have to worry about other armies stopping him by flanking him. Incorrect. Maximize beer hall by timing with Belgium shipments. Those people were already pissed at their leadership prior to pulling... Nope, that's also... This is General Demouriez, the guy who led the French forces into Belgium initially. That first push after Valmy. That is the end of valid answers. The real reason why General Demouriez had a lot of confidence about his initial invasion into the Austrian Netherlands was because he had the numbers. Remember, there were only like 14,000 troops defending the entire border. And he had something like 40,000 troops. So he knew he was going to outnumber anybody he ran into. And that's why he was confident rolling into that first engagement in Belgium. This one everybody should get. It's an intentionally easy answer, and the music's supposed to make you feel stressed. It's part of the fun, Dustin. Everyone says I hate fun. Let me correct a typo in my question. 60 seconds on the clock. Starts as soon as I finish the question. What was the single action taken by the French in 1793 that cut off all diplomatic solutions with both Prussia and Britain? Go. What was the single action taken by the French in 1793 that cut off all possible diplomatic solutions with both Prussia and Britain? 45 seconds left. What was the single action taken by the French in 1793 that cut off all possible diplomatic solutions with both Prussia and Britain? 30 seconds left. $20 seconds left. What was the single action taken by the French in 1793 that cut off all possible diplomatic solutions with both Prussia and Britain? Manny's in, Dustin's in, Sturf is in, Rocket's in. 5 seconds. All right, the first answer comes from they executed Louis. That is correct. The execution of King Louis XVI cut off all avenues of diplomatic solutions with both Britain and Prussia. Let's see if everyone else got it. France declared war on Britain. Nope, that was after. They killed Louis. That was the answer. I mean, you're not wrong. That also cut off diplomatic solutions for a while, but the reason the British stopped talking to the French was the execution of the king. Declared war on Britain for Manny. Incorrect. The execution of the king. Declared war. Nope. So remember, Britain had been negotiating with France all throughout the winter. Pitt was trying to avoid war, but the moment the king died, Britain went silent. Remember I said they basically cut off all diplomatic relations. That would be the modern day equivalent. That was the thing. And then again, remember that this also says Prussia. Prussia, Demouriez had been negotiating with. And King Frederick William II's demand was, I'm not cutting any deal with you until the king's back on the throne. Well, when you kill the king, that kind of kills that notion. All right. The next question coming at you is a short question. It should be a short answer, so Dustin can stop bellyaching about tapping on mobile. What will be the major catalyst for the war in the Vandee to begin? 60 seconds starts now. What will be the major catalyst for the war in the Vandee to begin? Rocket's in, and I saw it before it got deleted. That's right, Rocket. I'm pretty sure you got it right. 40 seconds left. What will be the major catalyst for the war in the Vandee to begin? This is question number 4 of 10. It flashed for just a second, and I saw the last section of it, and the way you abbreviate it, I was like, yeah, that's right. 25 seconds left. What will be the major catalyst for the war in the Vandee to begin? Manny is in with 10 seconds left. Only 2 of you. Okie dokie. First answer comes from Rocket. The levy of 300,000. That is correct. That troop impressment order that is going out to the departments of France, that the people in the Vendée, that's going to be the thing. They're like, nah, that's it. You've gone after the Catholic Church, and we're not really fans of the revolution to begin with, and now you're telling our people to go fight your war. So that is the right answer. Rocket gets it. Manny. A draft. I'm going to give that to you because that is what it is. It is a draft. The levy of 300,000 is a forced draft. It's impressment at the point of a gun, but the modern day equivalent is a draft. And yes, that is the thing. So I will give that one to Manny because he's on point with the concept. Manny moves to 11. GG Manny. This one, not so easy. Let me spell that word right.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Clonk that follow button. The next question, halfway through on this one. What was the major major misunderstanding of the Decree of Fraternity and the following December 15th proclamation? 60 seconds. What was the major misunderstanding of the Decree of Fraternity and the following December 15th proclamation? 50 seconds. What was the major misunderstanding of the Decree of Fraternity and the following December 15th proclamation? 35 seconds. Hope you guys like this whole you can't just read it from your notes format. Rocket is in with 20 seconds left. It's a wide variety of answers here with 5 seconds left that I would take. But it can be summarized with Robespierre's quote about you cannot force liberation at the point of a gun, effectively. The French troops would respect any and all things that the Belgians stood for, and instead became occupation versus liberation. No. It was more. Well, let's state the answer here. The general crux of the answer here is that our flavor of liberation will be welcomed, right? The whole idea that we're going to go in there and force French revolutionary values onto these liberated territories, and they would welcome that. So it's not that the decree had nothing to do with these 2 decrees. Had nothing to do with the French respecting all things. That had happened earlier in the year in 1792, a couple episodes ago. So it more was Robespierre saying, hey, look, fellas, this isn't going to work. You're going to send an army in there. They're going to enforce French principles on these people. And you're expecting them to say, oh, we're so happy that you're enforcing revolutionary values like seizing church and aristocratic property, taxing the rich, all those things that were in those decrees, you think they're just going to love that? You're insane. You can't force that kind of thing onto those people by force. It has to be, again, remember that inception moment where they have to go, we want this for ourselves. And that's how democracy, freedom, liberation actually has to spread. That's the answer. Anybody else to answer the question? No worries, Rocket. That's why we explain them. I like this format because I can go back over the concepts that are important, and we're not just saying what date and how many, which is what we were doing before. The next question. 60 seconds on the clock after I finish it. What was Georges Danton sent? Why was Georges Danton sent to the front in December 1792? Go. Why was Georges Danton sent to the front in 1792? There are a couple of possible answers here. I'll take the real answer or the PR answer. Either one is a good answer. Why was Georges Danton sent to the front in December 1792? You have 40 seconds. Terry, take a stab, man. You never know. You might get one right. 30 seconds on the clock. Why was Georges Danton sent to the front in December 1792? Rockets in with 15 seconds left. Ten seconds left. Why was Georges Danton sent to the front in December 1792? Time is up. We have one answer. Dustin, that might be your freebie, because I know you're on mobile, and you were super close to the buzzer. I will count that if it's right. Sent to the front to check on Demouriez to make sure his loyalty was still to the National Committee. Convention is the word. And not with the Austrians or King Louis. King Louis is dead, but that's the gist. He was sent to the front to check on Demouriez after rumors had started that Demouriez was starting to make alliances with local Dutch or Belgian conservatives. They wanted to make sure that, hey, you're still with us in the National Convention. King Louis is dead, but that's the gist of it. That's close enough. We will absolutely give that one to you. Okay, Dustin came in after the buzzer, but he's on mobile, and it was close because him and his slanderous paper were annoying people. That is Jean-Paul Marat, I think you're referring to, not Demouriez, and that is not correct. Speaking of Jean-Paul Marat, he's going to come back around in 2 episodes in a big way. Okie dokie. The next question. Timer starts after I finish reading it. What significant political agreement allowed Prussia to turn its attention back to its Western Front? Go. What significant political agreement allowed Prussia to turn its attention back to its Western Front? 50 seconds left. We have 3 questions after this one. What significant political agreement allowed Prussia to turn its attention back to its Western Front? 30 seconds. Rocket is in. Turi is in. I might be wearing something related to it right now. 20 seconds left. Ten seconds left. First answer comes to us from Manny gets into the buzzer. Second partition of Poland. That is correct. The second partition of Poland. Where they said, hey, let's take this little piece of Poland we have left and cut it up a little bit more. That's exactly the correct answer. The next answer comes to us from Turius. The splitting of Poland. Good enough? Next answer... Manny didn't beat the buzzer. And he said religion. Nope. The agreement that Catherine the Great would take a significant portion of what was left from Poland and give King Frederick William II that little buffer he needed allowed him to say, okay, we don't want to fight here. Catherine the Great didn't want to fight either. so I could take the bulk of the troops that I sent back east to shore up my flank and bring them back to bear on France. There will be a final partition of Poland, which will see Poland erased from the map until after World War I. But Catherine the Great will not be there for it. The next question. Explain the significance, or the significant, restructuring of the French army ordered by the convention, which is known as the Amalgame. Go. Explain the significant restructuring of the French army ordered by the convention known as the Amalgame. You can probably summarize this in less than 10 words if you want and be good, or be as detailed as you like. 40 seconds. Explain the significant restructuring of the French army. That is a problem, Rocket. So I can't delete that from here. I don't know why that didn't work. Why did that not work? Let me try it again. Well, there's a freebie for you in chat, everybody. I don't know why exclamation point answer didn't pick that up. But time is up, and Rocket's the only one that gets it anyway. And for some reason that didn't work. So let me try a test here real quick and just say answer test. Why did that not pick up?
Boy.
Maybe. That might be the thing. It triggered that first. Maybe I need to put that as a priority in queue. Avoid the word boy or fix in your answers. But that is right. Rocket gets it right. Volunteers will be paired with veterans that have been on the line and fought. 1 vet per 2 green boys. That's effectively the answer. So we will give that to Rocket. The mobile delay is tough on getting an answer. I can't help that. You know, Dustin, I empathize, but I never build my streams for mobile. I never have. So take your best stabs. I will understand if you're on mobile and kind of give you the benefit of the doubt on the time, but there we go. Rocky gets it. We have, where's my questions? All right, let me go through this, make sure. Yep, there's my test answer. Okay. We have 2 questions left. And I'm also trying to time this with the Omega. That's why I'm typing in the background. You think 1:30 would help instead of 1 minute? Yeah, the problem with that is this quiz already gets elongated, right? By each question having a minute and then everyone's answers. So maybe there's a balance in there. We could talk about it. I'm not opposed to it, but we started the quiz prior to 9, and it's 9:17 to give you an idea of how long the quiz is taking. Now, mind that. As long as people are answering. If it turns into the Rocket and Gilly show, then I don't care, right? So participate. I'll think about it. It means I gotta do a whole new video timer just to make Odd Dustin happy. But here comes your next question. We have 2 left. Question timer starts at the end of me speaking. What was the major strategic blunder of Demouriez' invasion of the Netherlands? That is the Dutch lowlands. What was the major strategic blunder of Demouriez' invasion into the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch lowlands? Not Belgium. What was the major strategic blunder? Yep, that's when you got the call, Rocket. What was the major strategic blunder of Demouriez' invasion into the Netherlands? The Dutch lowlands, not the Austrian Netherlands. Manny gets in with 25 seconds left in the clock. Dustin gets in. 10 seconds left. Rocket has extended her lead by 7 in Gilly's absence tonight. He's watching Doom with his in-laws. Rocket put an answer in anyway. 1 second, and here we go. First answer comes to us by Manny. Overconfidence. He thought since he had not been beaten, he could not be beaten. That is not the strategic blunder. So that is true. He thought that that's more relevant to after he was forced to retreat from the Dutch lowlands, when he was facing that 40,000 strong reconstituted Austrian army that was pushing out of Cologne because he hadn't made them go back across the river and instead invaded the Netherlands. That is the strategic blunder. That Demouriez decided to go north, did not secure the river to his east, and the Allies were allowed to regroup on the west bank of the Rhine, which means they did not have to make a crossing under fire and could spread out into Belgium again however they wanted. That was the strategic blunder. Dustin, the French were not good at... Don't know what that word is. That's also not it. Couldn't meet up with soldiers on the Rhine. No. So he should have linked up with the soldiers on the Rhine. He didn't, though. And not that he couldn't, but it's more that he left that army sitting at Cologne on the west side of the Rhine and didn't force them over. That's okay, Dustin. I just don't know what the word is. Keep answering. Last question of the night, and it is not... No, it had nothing to do with sieges. Let me put the proper possessive in there. Last question of the night. Timer starts when I finish reading the question. What was General Demouriez' major miscalculation when negotiating terms? Actually, let me rephrase this. I have to expand the question a little bit. Here we go. What was General Demouriez' major miscalculation while negotiating terms with the Allies while intending to march on Paris? Go. What was General Demouriez' major miscalculation while negotiating terms with the Allies while also intending to march on Paris? "45 seconds, Turi is in." What was General Demouriez' major miscalculation while negotiating terms with the Allies while also intending to march on Paris? "20 seconds. Last question of the night. Speaking of that, I should probably go make sure our good old friend Omega Jake is live and that I have Twitch muted. He is up, so we'll be good to go. Manny's in with 5 seconds. Alrighty. The first response comes from Turi. The loyalty of his officers to the revolution. That is exactly the correct answer. His officers weren't about to go with him and march on Paris to restore the monarchy under the, good graces of the Austrians. Rocket, his officers under command would follow him against the National Convention. That is also correct. That's another way to phrase it. Same answer. The next response. Misjudge the loyalty of his officers. That is the gist of it. Manny gets it. Anyone else to answer? That is the end of the valid answers. Anybody else really in there? Anybody else? Anybody? Going? Nope, that's it. All right, back we go.
Let's rock!
So, thank you for hanging out tonight, everybody, for episode 1.20. A significant milestone for me. We have been doing Fixers Heavy Metal History since May, when we decided that this was finally a thing that you all wanted to do, and after I had felt I had prepared enough for it, and I'm happy we continue to do this week to week. I hope you continue to learn things not only from our past, but how they shape our present. Yeah, we have a specific person we're rating tonight. It will be our good friend Omega Jake. He is streaming Phasmophobia with Permanoob. You'll be able to scare the bejesus out of Permanoob. And while we have done amazing things here, $2,020. It's actually $2,040 because I still owe $20 to that for Stop Soldier Suicide. And I hope we continue to just push that number higher for last week at Scare Drive. Make sure you also give some money to Extra Life. Mason's Little Warriors, which is the team for Extra Life that Omega is a part of, has raised 10 grand this year. He alone in this community and his community is like a tenth of that. And there's more than 10 streamers in there. He's done amazing this year. He's putting this up so that we can, mess with him, mess with Perm. So make sure that we go in there and do exactly that, because that's what we do. In the meantime, again, some schedule reminders. Monday, 2 p.m., we'll be back with Destiny. Tuesday night, Darkest Dungeon 2 early access on the day it releases, and we will all go have a look at what Red Hook has done for us, and it looks amazing in the previews. Then we'll be back on Friday with the final Destiny stream of Scare Drive, and then episode 1.21, which probably is going to be called something like Departmental Revolt or something like that, because it's not just about the Vandee, but the war in the Vandee and where it comes from. That'll be next week's topic.
No way!
Yes, way. But I appreciate your time, attention, your just love of being here. It really is what fuels me every week. So yeah. I really am speechless by the $2,000 thing. Yeah. Thank you all. Turi, Nully, for the massive donations tonight. Berlin, Manny, everyone, Dustin, Gilly, Rocket, everyone who's donated. And I hate to try to encapsulate all the names because it's been so many people. But thank you all from the bottom of my heart, because $2,000 to stop soldier suicide is not a small number. But we'll get out of here. We're going to go raid Omega Jake. He's on his starting screen. They should be up and running in about 5 minutes. So just hang out there. I've been communicating with him the whole time, basically saying, we have this many questions left. So he knows we're coming. We'll do our outro. And then we'll go say hi to Omega and hopefully scare the bejesus out of Perm. So thank you all for being here. Here we go. Dustin, I fixed it Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I just have to fix the BRB slide now. Hopefully back to Far Cry 6 with our friend Dustin on Monday morning, followed by Permanoob at 10 a.m. I have no clue what he's playing. He was on hiatus Thursday, Friday, but back at you on Monday morning. There's Gilly streaming tomorrow night, maybe, but definitely on Tuesday night. And he will probably lead into us for Darkest Dungeon. Go give him a follow if you're not. Then there is Rocket, who's streaming on Saturday mornings now at about 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, taking the place of Dustin. Also on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She was playing Far Cry 6 today. There's Surfers, who we're happy to see you back. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time-ish, or she eats a bean. Don't let her sell you on that 5-minute graceful bullcrap. And then we're on our way to this guy, Omega Jake, supporting Extra Life, Beaumont Children's Hospital, buying care of you. Monitors for the NICU there. We're out of here. Thank you for being here. I love you all, and thank you so much for your generosity. We'll see you on Monday.
Be excellent to each other.